Hi, I am Dr. Rasheem. I'm an independent scholar, a social scientist whose scholarship encourages a critical examination of society and culture through the lens of race, gender, class, and sexuality. As an instructor, I'm very much committed to helping students gain deeper insight into disciplinary, cross-cultural, intersectional approaches to the academic study of marginalized populations. Today, I want to talk to you about coming to terms with identity. What exactly do I mean about coming to terms with identity? So often we use different terms connected to and related to identity and who people are. However, we use those often wrong or interchangeably in ways that are not accurate. But it's a common thing that we do. And I think one of the reasons that we do it is the politics of identity has been a changing aspect of American culture forever. For example, the racial, social, and legal meaning of both race and gender is one that continues to evolve at any given point. What we mean by a particular identity changes at different points. So the evolution informs its implication. In many cases, it has meant the difference for folks between life and death. These socially constructed identities have real life implications that play out on a social strata that impact income, health, quality of life, access to opportunity, and power. One of the things that I hear people frequently mention around identity is that they're just social constructs, and to a very large degree, there are some identities that are highly socially constructed. Most of them, I would argue, are highly socially constructed, which is why they tend to change and ebb and flow. The challenge with it is they actually have, again, very real life implications that play out and impact people's quality of life. That's why we should probably pay a little bit more attention to these particular terms, how we use them, how we're referencing them, and making sure that we are as accurate as we possibly could be. And one of the best ways to do that, one is to just articulate what you mean by what you say. Also, connecting with a person who identifies in a particular way and allowing them to self-identify. Orlando Patterson tells us that identity politics took its modern form during the second half of the last century. So currently it's more in a state of an emancipatory mode of political action, right? Wherein people can and are looked to kind of self-identify. And even with that, there's still some pushback around people being able to self-identify. The social stratification of identity, it helps to reinforce power. So that's why it's particularly important. For example, racial hierarchy helps to situate whiteness in a way that informs access and opportunity in contrast to, let's say, blackness. Identity as a social construction of identity does not make it less real, largely because it affects, again, play out in real lived experiences, in real material ways, in many cases, loss of livelihood, and some unfortunate cases, loss of life. So there are a number of different types of identity, but the ones that I want us to talk about today are connected to social identity as well as personal identity. So types of identity and how they function in a social strata actually do provide currency. So let's take, for example, social identity. So social identity refers to affiliations with groups and shared beliefs or sometimes shared experiences. So a social identity could be a fraternity. It could be a particular institution where you received your degree. It could be where you work, right? And those have currency. Like on the surface, it may not sound like they have currency. But if you think about it, if a person, for example, says, I went to Yale, that's a social identity based on a particular group that has a currency in real life applications and how it's played out in real life. If folks say that they are from a particular neighborhood, you could probably think in your mind right now of a particular neighborhood that when a person says this neighborhood, oh, they make this kind of money. Or if they say they're in this neighborhood, oh, that is the wrong side of the tracks, or this is what that neighborhood is known for. So social identity has all of this cachet or currency. In the organization, CEOs are treated differently from interns. People who work in finance, there's all of these different levels of socially constructed identity that still have real life currency. Then, of course, we have personal identities. Now, personal identities, they refer to basically, they're connected to history. Sometimes they're connected to birth. Sometimes they're connected to family history. It's not as, so for example, social identity is based on your affiliation or connection to a larger affiliate group, like your connection to a group, whereas your personal identity is kind of a way in which you are grouped. I'll say a little bit more about that. So for example, an example of a personal identity may be your race, right? Another example of a personal identity may be your sexual orientation. Another one also may even be your class. Those are considered more personal identities. Like you would have this identity outside of your affiliation. That's probably a better way to say it. So in the social context, you are connected socially because you are a person who went to Yale. Whereas, for example, race, even if no one is around or no one knows, necessarily knows your parents, or if you're not in a room with your parents, they'll probably still be able to know your race. And in some cases, your gender, but we'll explore that more as well. So I want to talk a bit about common identity mix-ups, right? So one of the common identity mix-ups are race and ethnicity. People often use those as if they're the same thing. The way to identify, or the way I try to explain to folks, is race is largely, one, not only is it, of course, like so many of the others, a social construct, it is largely based on physical characteristics. So skin color, texture of hair, the way your eyes rest or sit. These are things that are very aesthetic, very superficial. Facial features, those are things that we group people connected to race with that. Ethnicity, the way in which ethnicity is different, it refers to a shared culture, shared language, shared ancestry, shared practices, shared beliefs. So for example, with that multitude of, let's say, the 10 people who they all have different ethnicities, you can also have in that scenario, think more specifically about a Black person who identifies as Hispanic, right? They speak a particular language, they have a particular set of beliefs and a particular set of practices. They may not identify ethnically with the Black person who is from Jamaica, who has a set of ancestry, a set of beliefs, a way of cooking food, a set of music that they listen to. So those two are not interchangeable. Another common identity mix-up that takes place is sex and gender. Sex is strictly biological, right? It is what you are assigned at birth based on your internal organs. Your genitalia is how the connection between sex and identity is very much connected to biology. Gender, on the other hand, is a bit more slippery. And the way that shows up is it is based largely on a spectrum of masculinity to femininity. And it has a set of aesthetics and performances that connect to masculinity and femininity. What do I mean by performance and aesthetics? I thought you would never ask. So what I mean by that is, for example, a feminine aesthetic may be lipstick, right? A feminine performance may be a mannerisms of how one holds their hand. A masculine aesthetic might be suspenders, overalls. something like that. Or tie, probably even more specific. A gendered performance or a gendered performance of masculinity would probably be something like who picks up the tab, who opens the door, those sort of things. Interest in sport. All of those things are connected to something that is not necessarily biological. It's very much aesthetic and performative. That brings me to another very much related concept, and that is terms of trans and cisgender. So cisgender just simply means it's denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender identity corresponds with their sex, right? So what does that mean in like regular conversation talk? A person who is cisgender, that means that their biological sex corresponds with their gendered expression of that sex. So I would identify as cisgender. I am biologically a female, and my gender representation, my aesthetic, my behaviors are in line with feminine expressions that are assigned to that biology. What comes up when it's not is transgender. Transgender is when your biology that you were assigned at birth based on your genitalia is different than that of your gendered or aesthetic expression. At the basis, right? That's what it is at the basis. Now, beyond any of those identities, beyond whether or not a person is identified as Black or white, Jamaican, Hispanic, cisgender, female, male, man, or woman, at the root of any identity, it's very important to allow each individual to self-identify. What is important for these particular definitions is when they do self-identify, you will know the differences of what they're saying about exactly who they are. I'd like to spend a little bit more time really briefly, just talking about what I mentioned earlier about the ways in which race and the construction of race has changed over the years. For example, there's been an evolution of whiteness. Whiteness has not always meant the same thing that it means today. So the way in which whiteness was thought of, let's say in the early 1600s, was that of you were British, you had an oval face, you were very pale. It was very much attached to a nationality. Now, there's always some othering going on. So with there being a set of folks that were white, there were other folks, Native Americans, who were considered tawny or dark. They weren't white. Then as you move into the 1800s, race and whiteness was very much connected to environment. So race was a dynamic category based on continental location, right? So you still just have these different centuries where what it means to be white changes. I think we're much more familiar with the ways in which how we identify folks who are Black have changed, or our naming of it is different. But what it has meant to be white has absolutely changed over time. So in the 1900s, whiteness was associated with elite and privilege. It was a very protected space. In fact, being sunburned was considered lower class. You did not want to have a tan, which is odd because, you know, people love to have tans today. Who would have thunk it? One of the more popular ways in which people who were not originally considered white, and so folks who were not considered white, they were Irish, Italian, Greece, Slavic. There's a whole litany of folks who were not initially in this category and accepted as white, but they kind of got their way in. And the top three ways in which folks would make their way, because again, this at this time, whiteness was not just based on a phenotype. It was privilege. It was elite. It was a class status to be white, not necessarily your physical appearance. So people who did not fit into that previous category, some of those previous categories around connected to like your environment or being from British, they got to weigh in with this with the change of whiteness being connected to being elite and connected to being privileged. Top 3 ways people bought their way or got to become white. 1, they acquired wealth. It didn't matter if the way that they acquired wealth was legal or illegal, but being wealthy transitioned you into this different spectra of identity, of whiteness. Another odd thing, joining the Democratic Party was a thing that delineated whiteness at a particular time in history. And then, of course, the last one is subscribing to racist or anti-Black beliefs. So there's this performance of whiteness around othering other people, and more specifically, othering Black people, that it helped to separate, for example, folks who were Irish or Italian or Slavic from this other lower class people. So this had, when I mentioned earlier, there's always this othering going on. In order to attain this status, you accomplish that by getting money, joining a particular social identity group, and also separating yourself from the others by performing racist acts or subscribing to racist acts or performing anti-Blackness. In another way, the legal construction of race has transformed and impacted several people. So, of course, as the evolution of whiteness is occurring, it changed the entire structure, the entire sphere, right? So in the 1790s, very early Congress figured out they were a young nation, but they knew that they were like the it group, right? So everyone's going to want to come there. And people wanting to migrate there, they thought about what type of people they would let in and what type of people they didn't want to have in. So what they did was basically pass the Naturalization Act, and that limited citizenship to free white people. So that helps, again, the construction of like not just whiteness, but you'll see in ways in how it shows up with identifying who the others are, right? So the rest of the world was barred. That statute stood unaltered over 100 years, impacting the composition of the U.S. Manifest Destiny. It gave them self-appointed ownership of the land, and it really established who the U.S. was as a country. Now, in this migration in early 1790s, where you have this young country establishing, okay, we only want people from white countries coming here. That did not transfer to their property. They were free to bring their property over, and they weren't even considered human beings. They were considered 3/5 of a human being. Black people, Africans, were considered 3/5 of a human being. So one might say, oh, 1790s, that couldn't have been. It couldn't have just been restricted to people from white countries, because we know that Black people were here and they were here before that and they continued to come over. Well, that rule did not include or consider Africans as even people. They were considered property. So a white person who was free could come and they could also bring their property. There's also the notorious one-drop rule. So the one-drop rule is a social and legal principle of racial classification. So it was historically prominent in the U.S. in the 20th century. It asserted that any person with even one drop of Black ancestry was considered Black. This concept became codified into the law in the early 20th century. So then you have these different identifying markers of the one Black rule, like how Black are you? So you have 1/8, your octoroon, quadroon, mulatto. You have all of these different delineations of Black. Another thing that determined identity as connected to the one drop rule is if a woman, if a Black woman, African enslaved woman, had sex with her master, that child was considered Black and was considered property. Um, and so then the connection there is, the rule is the citizenship or the identity of the mother is one that determines the identity of the child, right? That's one aspect that we actually don't currently still have. I still believe or still see ways in which the one drop rule still plays out in how we identify people that we didn't interact with. Even if we don't necessarily use terms like mulatto, quadroon, octoroon to have these delegations of how Black are you, there's still other ways in which there is this identifier, or it is understood that if you have a certain level of Black ancestry that is somewhat recent, then you are considered Black. So one of the reasons another reason that it's really important to have this whole conversation of coming to terms is that identities are in large part social constructs with real material implications, particularly as it relates to power, access, and the value and validity of human life. Even more than that, it's very important that even as we understand these terms and these particular definitions, two things. One, it may change to some degree in the next decade, or maybe even it'll take longer, century, but it is something that continues to evolve as we continue to evolve. And I think the second thing that is particularly important, it is very important to allow people to self-identify who they are, what aspects of their identity that they hold sacred, and interact with them as such.